The moment 30 police cruisers rolled onto her street, Captain Richard Hayes thought he was ending a problem. He had no idea he was creating one. The first flashing lights appeared just after sunrise, washing the quiet neighborhood in pulses of red and blue. Arlington mornings were usually peaceful. Sprinklers clicked across trimmed lawns. Dog walkers exchanged sleepy waves. Coffee brewed behind kitchen windows. But on this particular Tuesday, everything felt different. Curtains shifted. Front doors cracked open. Neighbors stepped onto porches, confusion spreading from one house to the next as vehicle after vehicle filled the narrow residential street. Within minutes, nearly 30 police units had surrounded a modest brick home near the end of the block. People whispered to each other. Some pulled out phones. Others simply stared. No one understood what was happening. At the center of it all stood a woman named Angela Brooks. Inside the house, Angela sat quietly at her kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee resting beside a stack of student essays waiting to be graded. Most people knew her as the patient teacher who bought school supplies with her own money when family struggled. Children waved to her at grocery stores. Elderly neighbors trusted her with spare house keys during vacations. She was the kind of person people described with the same words every time. Kind, reliable, quiet. The sudden chorus of sirens outside made her pause mid-sentence while grading a paper. She set her red pen down slowly. The sound grew louder, then louder still. Angela looked through the kitchen window. For several seconds, she simply stared. Police vehicles lined both sides of the street. Officers stood near driveways. More units continued arriving. The scene looked completely unreal. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow Angela often helped with groceries, stood frozen on her porch holding a watering can. Even from a distance, Angela could see confusion written across her face. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Then another. Then another. Firm. Official. Deliberate. Angela stood carefully and walked toward the front door. Her heartbeat remained steady. Years earlier, she had learned that panic rarely improved difficult situations. Outside, Captain Richard Hayes adjusted his jacket and watched the front porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. Several cameras from local media crews had already arrived near the intersection. Hayes noticed them immediately. Part of him welcomed the attention. Important operations attracted attention. Opportunities led to promotions. He glanced at the folder tucked beneath his arm. The anonymous report had seemed convincing enough. The information was detailed, specific, serious. By now he had convinced himself this was exactly the breakthrough he needed. The front door finally opened. Angela Brooks stepped onto the porch wearing a simple navy sweater and jeans. No fear, no anger, no confusion, just calm. The morning sunlight caught the edges of her silver necklace as she looked across the crowded street. For a brief moment, neither side spoke. Hayes expected anxiety. He expected questions. Instead, Angela simply observed the scene in front of her. Her eyes moved from the patrol cars to the officers, then to the gathering crowd of neighbors. Finally, they settled on Hayes. The captain straightened his posture. "Angela Brooks?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "What exactly is going on here?" Hayes gave a thin smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. Around them, the neighborhood fell completely silent. Even the distant barking of a dog seemed to fade away. Hayes took a slow step forward. "That," he said, lifting the folder slightly, "is exactly what we're here to find out." Angela looked at the folder, then back at him. The expression on her face never changed. And somehow, that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Angela held Captain Hayes's gaze for several seconds before answering. The cool morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp pavement as neighbors watched from every direction. No one spoke. The entire street seemed suspended in a strange silence. Hayes expected resistance. He expected nervous questions. Instead, Angela simply folded her hands in front of her and stood on the porch as though this were an ordinary conversation. That calmness irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Most people became uneasy when confronted by authority on this scale. Angela did not. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson slowly set down her watering can. A teenage boy riding his bicycle stopped near the corner. Even the mail carrier paused beside his truck. Everyone knew Angela Brooks. For years they had watched her leave every weekday morning before 7 o'clock, carrying a canvas tote bag filled with lesson plans and graded papers. They knew she spent weekends organizing book drives for local schools. They knew she checked on elderly neighbors during winter storms. They knew she volunteered at the community center twice a month. Hayes opened the folder and glanced at several pages. The paper rustled softly in the morning breeze. "You have been identified as a person connected to an active investigation," he said. Angela tilted her head slightly. "Connected how?" Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her face, searching for some sign of concern. A twitch, a nervous glance. Anything. He found nothing. Angela remained exactly as she was. Calm, measured, patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to finish explaining a mistake. Inside the house, a clock chimed softly from somewhere down the hallway. Angela could hear it through the open door behind her. It reminded her of ordinary mornings, of lesson plans, of children arguing over crayons, of everything that made this situation feel so unreal. Hayes finally cleared his throat. "We have reason to believe there may be information inside this property relevant to our inquiry." Angela looked past him at the long line of police vehicles stretching down the block. Sunlight reflected off windshields and chrome trim. The scene felt excessive, deliberately excessive. "That is a lot of officers for information," she said quietly. Several nearby officers shifted uncomfortably. Hayes ignored the comment. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" Angela shook her head. "No, I am asking a simple question." The captain's jaw tightened. Questions were not supposed to come from her. He was the one directing this conversation. A faint breeze rustled the maple tree beside the porch. Yellow leaves skittered across the driveway. Angela noticed a small group of her former students standing near the end of the street with their parents. One little girl recognized her and waved timidly. Angela smiled back. The gesture lasted only a second, but Hayes noticed. Something about it unsettled him. People looked at Angela with trust. Genuine trust. That kind of reputation was difficult to build and even harder to fake. For a brief moment, doubt crept into the edge of his thoughts. Then he pushed it away. The anonymous report had been detailed. The evidence summary looked convincing. Everything pointed here. Everything pointed to Angela Brooks. At least that was what he kept telling himself. The clouds were beginning to thin, allowing streaks of golden sunlight to spill across the neighborhood. It should have felt like the beginning of a normal day. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something much larger. She returned her attention to Hayes. "Captain," she said calmly, "before this goes any further, I think you should be absolutely certain about what you are doing." For the first time that morning, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Hayes's face. It vanished almost immediately, but Angela saw it. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this story had only just begun. Captain Richard Hayes did not like being questioned, especially not in front of an audience. The growing crowd along the sidewalks only made his irritation worse. Reporters had begun setting up cameras near the intersection. Neighbors whispered behind folded arms. Every passing minute made the operation feel less controlled and more public. Hayes glanced away from Angela and toward Lieutenant Scott Mercer, who stood near the command vehicle reviewing documents on a tablet. Mercer approached quickly, lowering his voice. "Everything is ready if you want to proceed." Hayes nodded but did not immediately answer. His eyes drifted back to Angela. She had not raised her voice. She had not shown the slightest sign of panic. Somehow that calmness made her seem stronger than the dozens of officers surrounding the property. Hayes hated that feeling. 3 days earlier, this situation had looked very different. He had been sitting alone in his office reviewing promotion evaluations when the anonymous report landed on his desk. Most tips were vague. This one was not. It contained dates, names, locations, and references to activities that sounded serious enough to demand immediate attention. The sender claimed that Angela Brooks possessed information connected to a sensitive matter involving government records. The report suggested hidden materials, undisclosed contacts, and unexplained communications. Every paragraph seemed designed to trigger concern. At first, Hayes had been skeptical. Then he noticed something else. The report included details that appeared impossible for an ordinary person to know. That changed everything. Over the next 48 hours, he became increasingly convinced he had uncovered something significant. Now, standing in front of Angela's home, he felt the pressure of those expectations. If he backed down, questions would follow. If he pushed forward, answers might finally emerge. Across the street, sunlight reflected off the windows of nearby houses. The neighborhood looked almost painfully ordinary. Children had left bicycles near driveways. American flags hung from front porches. Wind chimes stirred softly in the breeze. Nothing about the place matched the image Hayes had built in his mind. Angela watched him carefully. Years of teaching had taught her how to read people. She recognized uncertainty when she saw it. She recognized pride too. Hayes was a man determined to prove something, perhaps even to himself. That realization concerned her more than the police presence. People searching for truth were predictable. People searching for validation often were not. Cameras immediately turned toward the house. Hayes noticed and straightened his shoulders. The operation was no longer private. Every decision would now be seen, discussed, and judged. Angela followed his gaze toward the reporters. "This seems important to you," she said quietly. Hayes looked back at her. "It is. More important than being certain?" The question landed. Harder than he expected. For a moment he said nothing. Somewhere behind him a radio crackled with routine updates. Officers shifted positions. Leaves drifted across the pavement. Ordinary sounds filled the silence between them. Then Mercer stepped forward again. "Captain, we found something else." Hayes turned immediately. Mercer handed him a printed sheet. Hayes scanned the page. Angela could not see the document, but she noticed the change instantly. Whatever information had just arrived seemed to reinforce his confidence. Hayes folded the paper and slipped it into the folder. When he faced Angela again, the hesitation was gone. The uncertainty had disappeared behind a renewed sense of purpose. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice firm once more, "this investigation is moving forward." Angela studied him for a long second. Then she nodded slowly, almost sadly, as though she had expected that answer all along. Behind her, inside the quiet house, a hallway door remained closed. It was the only door in the entire home that visitors never entered. And as dozens of eyes focused on the front porch, not a single person on that street realized that the real story had not yet begun. The atmosphere changed the moment Captain Hayes gave a subtle nod. Officers began moving with renewed purpose. Not aggressively, not recklessly, but with the confidence of people who believed they were on the verge of uncovering something important. The crowd along the sidewalks grew larger. More neighbors emerged from their homes. A reporter adjusted a microphone near the curb while a cameraman focused his lens on Angela's front porch. Angela stepped aside from the doorway. Her expression remained composed, but inside she felt a familiar disappointment settling into her chest. Not fear, not panic, disappointment. She had spent most of her life believing that facts eventually mattered more than assumptions. Yet standing there now, watching strangers examine her life through the lens of suspicion, she wondered how quickly people could forget everything they thought they knew about someone. Hayes exchanged a few quiet words with Lieutenant Mercer before several officers entered the house. Angela remained outside on the porch under the watch of multiple personnel. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the brick steps beneath her feet. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson looked as though she wanted to say something but could not find the words. Angela offered her a small, reassuring smile. The elderly woman placed a hand over her heart. Inside the home, drawers opened. Closet doors shifted. Cabinets were inspected. Each noise felt strangely personal. This was the house Angela had spent 14 years turning into a home. Every room held memories. The living room contained shelves filled with books donated by former students. The dining room displayed framed photographs from school graduations and community events. The kitchen walls carried small notes written by children she had taught over the years. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. You helped me believe in myself." Those messages remained taped beside the refrigerator long after the students had grown older. Yet none of that seemed visible today. To the people searching the house, it was simply a location connected to a file, a place attached to an allegation. Nothing more. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Hayes stood near the command vehicle reviewing updates while reporters continued speculating from a distance. Then one officer emerged carrying a sealed storage box from an upstairs closet. The sight immediately triggered whispers among the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Neighbors exchanged worried looks. Angela watched quietly. She knew exactly what was inside those boxes. School records, old teaching materials, volunteer program documents. Years of ordinary life compressed into cardboard containers. Yet perception often moved faster than truth. Hayes noticed the reaction from the crowd, and felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, something visible. Finally, something that looked significant. Mercer approached him again. "We are finding a lot more material than expected." Hayes folded his arms. "Keep going." Angela heard the exchange. The words lingered in her mind. Not evidence. Not wrongdoing. Material. Yet already the narrative was beginning to form. She could see it in the faces around her. People searching for answers. Often settled for appearances. A sudden gust of wind swept down the street. Leaves scattered across lawns and sidewalks. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the quarter hour. Angela glanced toward the second-floor window at the far end of the house. Behind that wall sat the one room no visitor had ever entered. The room remained locked. Private. Unchanged for years. Hayes followed her gaze and noticed the brief look upward. His eyes narrowed instantly. For the first time all morning, he felt something close to certainty. He turned toward Mercer. "I want every room checked," he said firmly. "Every single one." And as officers disappeared deeper into the house, Angela slowly closed her eyes for a moment, knowing the day was about to become far more complicated than anyone standing on that street could possibly imagine. The tension on the street deepened as the search continued. Nearly an hour had passed since the first officers entered the house, and what had begun as curiosity among the neighbors was slowly turning into uncertainty. People no longer whispered with confidence. They whispered with questions. If Angela Brooks was truly hiding something dangerous, why did she seem so calm? Why had nothing alarming been brought out of the house? Why did every box carried outside contain ordinary documents, books, photographs, and school materials? Captain Hayes refused to acknowledge those questions. He remained focused on the second floor. Something about Angela's brief glance toward that area continued to occupy his thoughts. He convinced himself it had meaning. He convinced himself it was the missing piece. Across the lawn, reporters adjusted camera angles while officers moved through room after room. Then suddenly Lieutenant Mercer appeared in the upstairs hallway window. His expression had changed. Hayes immediately noticed. Seconds later, Mercer emerged through the front door, carrying a small metal lockbox. It was not large, roughly the size of an old file case. Yet the moment people saw it, the atmosphere shifted again. Cameras zoomed closer. Neighbors leaned forward. Hayes walked directly toward Mercer. "Where was it?" he asked. "Inside the locked room. Upstairs." Hayes felt a pulse of satisfaction. Finally, something hidden, something secured, something that looked important. He took the box and examined it carefully. The metal surface showed years of wear. No markings, no obvious clues, just a simple lock. Angela watched from the porch without speaking. Hayes turned toward her. "Would you like to explain this?" Angela's eyes settled on the box. For the first time all morning, a trace of emotion crossed her face. Not fear, not panic, something closer to sadness. "That box does not belong in your hands," she said quietly. The statement immediately reinforced Hayes' assumptions. Around them, several officers exchanged glances. Reporters scribbled notes. The crowd interpreted her words exactly as Hayes did. Whatever was inside must matter. Hayes lifted the box slightly. She saw Mrs. Patterson. She saw former students. She saw people she had known for years. Some looked worried. Others looked confused. None looked hostile. That mattered to her. More than the cameras. More than the accusations. More than the operation unfolding around her home. She took a slow breath. "Captain," she said, "you still have an opportunity to stop this before you make a mistake that cannot be undone." Hayes almost laughed. The confidence in her voice sounded absurd to him. 30 officers were present. Multiple agencies had committed resources. Media coverage was growing by the minute. Not without answers. "Open it," he told Mercer. The lieutenant examined the lock briefly. It was old and uncomplicated. Within moments, the box clicked open. Every conversation on the street seemed to stop at once. Hayes leaned forward. Mercer slowly lifted the lid. Inside there were no stacks of secret files. No bundles of cash. No mysterious documents. No evidence of criminal activity. There was only a single object resting neatly on dark velvet fabric. An old cellular phone. Nothing more. The silence that followed felt almost surreal. Hayes stared at it. Reporters looked confused. Even the officers standing nearby seemed unsure what they were seeing. Angela stepped down from the porch. Her shoes touched the walkway with soft, measured steps. Then she stopped a few feet away from the open box. The morning breeze stirred loose strands of her hair as sunlight reflected off the phone's worn surface. "Captain," she said quietly, "I am asking one final time. Please give me that phone." Hayes looked from the device to Angela. Then he shook his head. "Why?" Angela met his eyes. Her voice remained calm. "Because the moment I make one call, everything about today is going to change." For several seconds, nobody moved. The old phone rested inside the open lockbox like the most ordinary object in the world, yet every eye remained fixed on it. Captain Hayes stared at Angela, waiting for her confidence to crack. It never did. The late morning sun had climbed higher now, casting long reflections across windshields and front windows. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. The neighborhood continued breathing around them, while the tension on Angela's front lawn seemed frozen in place. Hayes folded his arms. "One phone call," he asked. "That is what all of this is about." Angela looked at the device and then back at him. "No," she answered softly. "This is not about the phone. It is about what happens after the phone rings." Several reporters exchanged glances. Pens moved across notepads. Camera lenses adjusted. The statement sounded strange, but there was something in her voice that made people listen. Not because she was loud, because she was certain. Lieutenant Mercer held the phone carefully, as if expecting some hidden explanation to suddenly reveal itself. Instead, he found only age. The device looked outdated by more than a decade. Scratches covered its surface. The screen was dark. Nothing about it suggested importance. Hayes pointed toward it. "That old thing." Angela nodded. "Yes." "You expect me to believe that one outdated phone changes anything?" Angela did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the maple tree near the edge of the yard. The leaves shimmered softly beneath the sunlight. For a moment, she seemed far away, lost in memories no one else could see. Then she spoke. "Some promises do not expire." The words confused nearly everyone listening. Hayes felt irritation rising again. Every answer seemed wrapped inside another mystery. Every question led somewhere he could not quite reach. Yet despite that frustration, he could not ignore the growing discomfort in his own instincts. The operation had produced nothing that matched the accusations. No dangerous materials. No hidden records. No evidence supporting the dramatic claims that had brought 30 officers to this street. Across the road, Mrs. Patterson slowly stepped closer to the edge of her property. Several neighbors followed. The crowd no longer looked at Angela with suspicion. They looked at her with concern. The shift was subtle but impossible to miss. Angela noticed it too. She appreciated their support, but she wished none of them had been dragged into this. The attention, the cameras, the speculation, none of it belonged here. This had once been a quiet street where children played basketball in driveways and neighbors exchanged cookies during the holidays. Now it felt like a stage built for someone else's mistake. A gentle breeze passed through the neighborhood. Angela closed her eyes for a brief moment and inhaled deeply. Fresh grass, spring air, familiar scents, familiar comforts. They reminded her of something important. Fear only grows when people forget who they are. When she opened her eyes again, the calm had returned fully. Hayes noticed. So did Mercer. In fact, many of the officers noticed. The woman standing before them looked less like someone under pressure and more like someone waiting patiently for others to catch up to the truth. Finally, Angela extended her hand toward the phone. "Please." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Let me make the call." Hayes looked at the device one last time. Then at Angela. Then at the reporters. The crowd. The officers. Yet curiosity had become stronger than caution. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. Mercer placed the phone into Angela's waiting hand. The moment her fingers wrapped around it, a strange silence settled across the entire street. It felt as though even the wind had stopped to listen. Angela turned the phone over once in her hand. The device looked almost fragile beneath the sunlight, as though it belonged in another era. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then she pressed the power button. Nothing happened. Several people in the crowd exchanged puzzled looks. Captain Hayes allowed himself a faint smile. The old phone appeared completely dead. Even Lieutenant Mercer looked uncertain. But Angela remained patient. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. A soft glow appeared across the worn display. The reaction was immediate. Hayes frowned. Mercer leaned slightly forward. Angela entered a short sequence of numbers from memory. She did not hesitate once. The phone began dialing. No one spoke. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. One ring. 2 rings. Then the call connected. Angela raised the phone to her ear. "This is Angela Brooks," she said calmly. The change in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. It carried the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking with people whose decisions affected lives. Several seconds passed as she listened. "The protocol number is Sierra 741. Captain Hayes felt a strange chill move through him. Protocol number. The phrase sounded official. Deliberately official. Angela listened again. "Yes, sir. They are here now." Her eyes briefly met Hayes's. "No, sir. I have remained cooperative." More silence. Then Angela nodded once. "Understood." She lowered the phone. The call had lasted less than a minute. Hayes folded his arms. "That is it." Angela looked at him steadily. "That is enough." The answer irritated him. Yet before he could respond, a radio crackled somewhere behind the command vehicle. An officer reached for it immediately. Then another radio activated. Then another. Conversations erupted across multiple channels at once. Confused voices. Urgent requests. Verification codes. Names. Orders. Hayes turned sharply toward Mercer. "What is happening?" Mercer was already checking his tablet. His face had gone pale. "Captain." He stopped. Looked again. Then looked up. "You need to see this." Hayes grabbed the tablet. A notification banner stretched across the screen. Then another. Each carried federal identification markers he had never personally encountered before. His stomach tightened. The first message instructed all participating personnel to halt further activity pending immediate review. The second reference protected federal status. The third contained a name. Angela Brooks. Hayes read it twice. Then a third time. His mouth suddenly felt dry. Around them, officers were beginning to notice the change. Radios continued chirping. Supervisors stepped aside to take calls. Reporters sensed something had shifted and immediately focused their cameras toward the command area. Angela remained perfectly still. The wind moved softly through the trees behind her house. She had expected this, not because she wanted it. A black SUV turned onto the street. Then another. Both vehicles moved slowly past the gathered crowd. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just quiet authority. They stopped near the command vehicle. The doors opened. Several individuals stepped out wearing dark suits and identification badges. Their arrival transformed the atmosphere instantly. Conversations stopped. Officers straightened. Even Hayes seemed unable to look away. One of the newcomers approached directly toward Angela. He appeared to be in his late 50s, silver-haired, composed, carrying himself with the effortless confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice. When he reached Angela, he smiled warmly. "Ms. Good morning, Mr. Calloway." Hayes felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood. The man turned toward him. His expression remained polite, professional, yet there was unmistakable gravity in his eyes. "Captain Hayes," he said, "I believe there has been a very serious misunderstanding." And for the first time since arriving that morning, Hayes realized he might not be the person in control of this situation at all. The words settled over the neighborhood like a sudden change in weather. A very serious misunderstanding. Captain Hayes stared at Mr. Calloway, searching for some indication that this was merely another layer of confusion. He found none. The silver-haired official accepted a tablet from one of the individuals who had arrived in the black SUVs and reviewed several documents before turning the screen toward Hayes. The captain's eyes moved across the display. His confidence faded with every line. Protected federal partner. Special designation status. Historical service recognition. The phrases seemed impossible when connected to the woman standing quietly on the front lawn. Hayes looked up. There has to be some mistake. Mr. Calloway's expression remained calm. That is exactly what we are here to determine. Around them, officers continued receiving updated instructions through their radios. Some stepped back from the property. Others began documenting equipment and inventory. The entire operation was slowly shifting direction. Angela watched silently. She did not appear victorious. She did not appear angry. If anything, she looked tired. Years of teaching children had taught her that being right rarely felt as satisfying as people imagined, especially when the truth arrived after unnecessary damage had already been done. Hayes glanced toward the house, toward the boxes that had been carried outside. "Who are you?" he finally asked. The question came out quieter than he intended. Angela held his gaze for several seconds. Then she answered, "A teacher." A few neighbors smiled despite the tension. The response sounded simple, yet somehow it carried more weight than any title. Mr. Calloway nodded slightly. And before that, he said, someone who provided assistance during a period when certain people in government needed extraordinary help. The crowd listened carefully. Reporters stopped talking and started recording every word. Hayes looked back at the documents. Why was none of this disclosed? Mr. Calloway folded his hands. Because some agreements remain protected long after they are signed. The answer explained enough without revealing details. Angela appreciated that. She had spent years building a quiet life. She never wanted recognition. She certainly never wanted a fleet of vehicles arriving on her street. Yet here they were, a consequence of someone else's assumptions. One of the federal representatives approached Mr. Calloway and handed him another report. He reviewed it briefly before turning toward Hayes. We have also identified the source of the anonymous complaint. Hayes straightened immediately. Who was it? Mr. Calloway's eyes hardened for the first time. An individual connected to a previous internal review involving misconduct allegations. Hayes felt his stomach sink. Suddenly pieces began falling into place. The unusually detailed report. The pressure. The carefully constructed narrative. Someone had known exactly which buttons to push. Someone had wanted this operation to happen. She recognized the description. Years ago, she had reported behavior she believed was wrong. She had done so quietly, professionally. She never expected revenge. Yet some people carried old grudges longer than others carried principles. The realization seemed to hit Hayes all at once. He looked around at the cameras, the officers, the neighbors, the house, then finally at Angela. For the first time that day, he saw the situation through different eyes. Not as an investigation, not as an opportunity, as a mistake. A very public mistake. Children watched from the end of the street. Elderly neighbors stood beside flower gardens. Ordinary people who had trusted her for years. Hayes slowly removed his cap and held it at his side. He seemed older than he had an hour earlier. Less certain. More human. Angela noticed. She could have embarrassed him. She could have demanded explanations. Instead, she simply waited. Because some lessons arrived best in silence. And standing there beneath the bright Virginia sky, surrounded by evidence of a life built on service rather than suspicion, the truth no longer needed her help to speak for itself. By late afternoon, the street had begun to look like itself again. The reporters were gone. The federal vehicles had departed. One by one, the remaining police units rolled away beneath a sky painted with soft gold and pale blue. Angela stood on her front porch holding a cardboard box filled with school papers that had been returned to their proper place. The house was still not entirely back to normal. Chairs needed to be moved. Documents needed to be reorganized. A few picture frames sat temporarily on the dining room table waiting to be hung again. Yet none of that bothered her. Homes could be restored. Trust took longer. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson slowly crossed the road carrying a covered casserole dish. Her silver hair glowed beneath the evening sunlight. "I thought you might not feel like cooking tonight," she said gently. Angela smiled. "Thank you." The older woman hesitated before speaking again. "We never doubted you." Angela looked around the neighborhood. Several neighbors waved from their yards. A former student riding a bicycle lifted one hand in greeting. The sight warmed her heart more than she expected. "I know," Angela replied softly. Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand before returning home. The evening settled comfortably over the neighborhood. Inside the house, Angela placed the casserole in the kitchen and walked toward the living room. On the coffee table sat the old phone. The same phone that had quietly carried years of responsibility, promises, and memories. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. Then she placed it back inside the lockbox and gently closed the lid. Some chapters of life were not meant to be displayed. They were meant to be honored quietly. A knock sounded at the front door. Angela opened it and found Captain Richard Hayes standing alone on the porch. No uniformed officers. No vehicles. No cameras. He held his cap in both hands. The confidence that had accompanied him that morning was gone. In its place stood humility. "May I speak with you?" he asked. Angela nodded. They sat on two wooden chairs overlooking the front yard. For several seconds, neither spoke. The evening breeze moved softly through the trees overhead. Finally, Hayes looked down. "I was wrong." The words came slowly, but they were sincere. "Not just about you. About a lot of things." Angela listened quietly. Hayes stared toward the street. "I wanted results. I wanted recognition. I convinced myself I was chasing the truth." He paused. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether I had all the facts. Angela folded her hands in her lap. The fading sunlight painted warm colors across the neighborhood. What matters now is what you do next, she said. Hayes nodded. I know. He stood a few moments later and extended his hand. Angela shook it. There was no bitterness in her expression, no triumph, only grace. As Hayes walked away down the sidewalk, he seemed lighter somehow. Not because his mistake had disappeared, but because he had finally acknowledged it. The following Monday morning, Angela returned to her classroom. The familiar scent of dry erase markers and freshly sharpened pencils greeted her as students filled the room with energy and laughter. One little boy raised his hand before the lesson even began. Ms. Brooks. Angela smiled. Yes. The boy tilted his head. Were you scared? The classroom grew quiet. Angela looked around at the young faces watching her. Then she smiled gently. Yes, she said. Sometimes doing the right thing feels scary. The boy considered her answer carefully before nodding. Outside the classroom window, sunlight spilled across the playground. Children laughed in the distance. A flag moved softly in the breeze. Angela picked up her lesson plan and began teaching. And as the warm light filled the room, the noise of that difficult morning seemed farther away than ever, leaving behind only a simple truth. Character is not revealed when life is easy. It is revealed when kindness remains even after every reason to lose it.